Back in early 2000s, you received your artistry degree from Université Paris-Sorbonne, and later a graphic design certificate from MGM Design School. And then in 2005, you moved to Seattle to pursue a career as a creative director in advertising. And many more roles came along years after that, like graphic designers at Marchex, creative director at Catalysis, co-founder and creative director at Tech Diversified. Then you slowly started to do some UX, it seems like in 2012, until you become an established senior UX designer for Anthro-Tech, then Tableau, and you are now a lead user experience designer at Salesforce. And I didn't even mention your volunteer experience at Intentionalist, Europe Seattle, and currently Black Girls Code. What were the biggest highlights of these years, in graphic design to that creative direction, or like what would you say were the biggest highlights?
It's interesting because I remember those years too, between 2000. So I started 2005 with what I call traditional advertising. So it was like print, a lot of print, radio, TV, so traditional advertising. And it was right at the cusp where things were going digital. So by 2006, 2007, you had like online banners. And I'm like, I sound like an old, but then it was like the banners and then everybody wanted a website. Nobody wanted to spend so much money on radio, which is in TV, which is so expensive. And we're like, let's just do a website, which is much cheaper. And so with that, so those were the years where it's kind of like, oh, I need to hone in on these new things that are coming up and just keep up with it because of demand. And so teaching yourself, oh, I need to know. And back then we were doing everything in Photoshop still for online band or Flash. Adobe Flash was there. So you kind of, as things, you have to be on top of where the market is, on what the demand is, and kind of be able to pivot. So be flexible enough to pivot with it. And I think I was good at that, where I was like, I was embracing it instead of pushing back, like this doesn't make sense and nobody understands the art of print anymore. No, I didn't do that. I was more like, this is interesting. You can do a lot more things here. And so being able to pivot with the market, pivot with the times, I think and being able to be flexible is something that I think I had and was open to, which helped me a lot.
Right, being flexible is key because it also seems like, so is kind of 2012 when you started to also do some UX, because it seemed like you were just talking right now about building some websites, and building website is like, of course, the marketing side, but there is also, of course, a UX aspect to it. And so it seems like that's kind of maybe the year when you started to dive into UX a little bit. And so what motivated you to actually keep looking into UX and being like, let's look into this a little further?
Yeah, there were a couple of things. The first thing, I have to admit that the first couple of years of like online, the digital stuff, I was very, and I think the market was like that too, where as we're learning what this world is, we're very dependent on the visuals. So visuals were like the thing that, so it was a very visually driven kind of results, and everything had to be beautiful still. And that's how we were going through it. And then I also started working with developers closely, front-end developers, which was a new world for me too. I was like, whoa. But then working very closely with them and understanding it from their perspective, and what they're trying to solve for and how they're building this helped a ton. When we were sitting together for hours in front of the screen and just going through the work, that really helped too. And then at that point, I kind of realized that there's more to it than just like the visuals, because we were relying on visuals, to be honest, for a while, and got away with it for a while. But at some point, the visuals weren't enough to solve for what we're trying to sell, what we're trying to portray. And at that point, it's like really trying to start looking at, well, what does someone need from this? Like, what are we trying to solve for? And that's where the pivot started into, I would say, more into the UX and less into the visual. I say visual, not less, but like in a different way. We're not getting away with things just with visuals.
Right. Just because it looks cool, let's build it.
But pretty at some point is like, it's not solving. So yeah.
Exactly.
And I think also scalability at some point, like as it grows, and we're like, okay, we have this visual, but then we can't, how do we add to it content, and how do we like the growth scalability piece to it? Like these are things you have to solve before you even think about visuals.
So that's how you slowly transitioned. And how did you actually go to learn UX? because it doesn't seem like, based on your LinkedIn profile, that you have a traditional UX degree from any sort of university, because frankly didn't exist. So how did you actually transition?
Honestly, I'm still learning. I feel like I'm still learning, especially now. You're like you mentioned, now there's all these like 4-year degrees or master programs or, 3 months programs, whatever it is. And people are coming in with like frameworks and terminology and stuff that I guess that I ended up going, oh, I'm doing that. I just didn't know it had a term, like it had a name to it. I was more organic about it.
Right.
I think I learned as I go. And anytime I found myself stuck on something I need to solve, I would just do my research. I would reach out to people who have done it before, perhaps know of people who have had to deal with similar situations, and learn from them. Be humble enough to say, "Hey, I don't know," but I'm like willing to do what it takes in order to ramp up and
Right.
understand. And so, yeah, it truly was, as it still is as we go. I think it is the humbling thing. Is like, I
Mhm.
don't need to know everything. I need to be engaged. I need to be interested and passionate about it. And
Mhm.
and I don't need to feel like, there were times where I felt, you feel like, especially when you're starting out, like you need to have all the answers and you're the one who needs to find the answers by yourself.
Yeah.
You have a whole team. And it's okay to, like, true collaboration and true teamwork, where sometimes you have the answers and sometimes you don't and others do, but you have to communicate with transparency.
Absolutely. I'm super glad that you're saying this, because the imposter syndrome, especially for people just joining the UX world, is just so overwhelming. Like, there's so many UX methodologies, so many things that you could keep diving and diving into, and it never ends, right? If you just, let's take accessibility, and accessibility is a huge domain. And if you want to actually become an expert, you could just do accessibility.
Yeah. And I think also what I've noticed is that every company or space that you're going to work for has their own terminology and has
Hmm.
their own things that they're focusing on. Like, I went for 12 years, my career, without hearing certain terminologies that nowadays where I'm at, it's like every day I'm using these words, where before I didn't have to use them at all. And so when I started here 12 years in, I felt really bad. I was like, how did I go 12 years in UX and not know certain terminology? But guess what? That's what they use right where I'm at today. So, and I know that I'm older, so it's easier to say it. But I do think the, the, if you are able to come in and be just more comfortable with the fact that you don't need to know everything, that
Hmm.
is, no, that's not expected of you either. And
Hmm.
that more honest you are, the better, the faster we get to the place where we are all understanding each other. We can teach each other. I'm educating my developers every day. My developers are educating me every day.
Hmm.
PMs, I mean, it's always going to be other folks knowing other. That's why you have a team. Everybody knows something.
So you've done UX for, in the past 10 years, roughly, you would say, and officially since 2019. So thinking back and reflecting on your UX career so far, how does it compare with your years in, like creative direction, advertising?
I see a lot of similarities as far as like
Mhm.
um, how to start a project. Because even before in graphic design or in advertising, you have to understand who your user is or audience. We call it audience.
Mhm.
Who is your audience? What's your primary audience, secondary audience? Well, nowadays I have to understand who my user is, my primary user, my secondary user. I have to understand what their goals and objectives are. I have to
Mhm.
understand that in advertising too, when we're thinking of advertising campaigns.
Mhm.
I have to work with a multidisciplinary team with I had project managers. I have product managers now. I had accounts people in advertising. I have developers. So the soft skills very much serve me very similarly, where you're kind of working with all different types of people. You have clients or a problem statements that you're trying to solve for.
I think that's the similarities that you brought up. Like, as you was talking about this, I was like, well, this is great for graphic designers when you want transitioning, to be like, hey, I already have a lot of transferable skills, whether I realize it or not, that's on my resume, on my LinkedIn, or whatever it is. I can help and augment and try to create that bridge between my past career to that new UX career, right? And there's So
added
many
value.
of them. Right.
For me, I've always used that as an added value with my
Mm-hmm.
positioning as far as like my competitors, because, and it serves me. Just last month, I'm on the product side. I'm working on features, but guess what? I'm working on a brand new feature, and the marketing team needed help in putting a video together to highlight this feature for their PR work coming up. And so I could jump right in, create a video, a marketing type video. I knew how to work with their marketing art director because that's who I was back in the day. And so it's things like that. Or if you need a logo somewhere, if you understand branding, like I
Right.
understand branding. So even with the feature, as I'm working on a feature, I can think of how can we market it, or how can it stand out from a branding
Right.
perspective. So it's all added value. Yeah.
Right. Right. That's actually a good point. And one of the things that people think when they think UX, they think the user as the default and potentially the sole thing that we should care about as UX designers. But like as you mentioned, the business aspect is also big, right? Understanding just enough of the KPIs or just enough of what are we actually trying to achieve and connect the user needs with the business needs is key.
And I think that's another similarity again, because
Right. Right.
yes, I am the advocate for the user at the table, right? In my current job. So the PM, the product manager, is the business advocate. And the developer manager is the one for feasibility. Can we do it or not? And I'm there speaking for advocating for the user. So yes, however, I need to understand what the business goals are. I need to understand what is feasible and what's not when I'm going into design. Same was in advertising and marketing days. I needed to understand what the agency needed out of this and what the client needed, what the client goals were. The client had their clients that I had to design for, but what is the client's KPIs are? So it's all the same.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. Well, and so now that you are a lead UX designer, I'm sure you see a lot of UX portfolios. And so one question that I have for you is like, as someone seeing so many portfolios, like which are the ones that really stand out to you the most? And why? Is there even some sort of common denominator in or trend that you notice?
It's a great question, and one that I've been thinking about a lot lately. Because as you see a lot of portfolios, and I feel like the way the UX industry has kind of evolved, we're in a place right now where I'm kind of struggling because I'm part of the problem too, where we're in a place where it's almost like a factory. I feel like in many times where like there's a certain format for a portfolio and just follow this format and do your 5-6 case studies and do the thing. It's like almost a factory of like, and so every time I go through it ends up all looking the same. And where's the personality piece of it? The ones and again, I struggle with that for myself as well. It's like, how do I present myself where I feel like I'm myself? I still present my UX skills, but where I can show who I am. And so I think the ones that stand out still are a balance of seeing your UX work. And I've seen portfolios that are not that great where it's very high level. So you do have like the whole process broken down, but not enough in depth. So like, for instance, I created these persona, like the first section is after discovery, I identified 3 personas, and I see the 3 personas and I identify them because I think that for this type of product, this is the age group and this is the, but what are you basing it on? Did you do any is there any data to inform? Like, what is the actual meat?
Right. Right.
So, and what did you do what type of research methodology did you choose specifically for this that was relevant to the specific problem area that you identified? So it's kind of like high level, like very on the surface versus something that I see a little more in-depth thinking. And so as far as the process goes, really wanting that in-depth story of how did you get there? Like why? And then eventually when you get to your design decisions, how do you map it back to what you discovered early on so that it does. And this is why I decided to design it this way, because it responds to what we found out about the people we're going to be using. So kind of like mapping it back to the whys is really important. And then again, in order to not I always enjoy a portfolio that gives me a little bit more flair of who the person is, who you are.
Mm-hmm.
So I understand now that you can do the work, but who are you? At the end of the day,
Right, right.
we're all humans, and I just want to get to know you a little bit. Is there something? Are you passionate about? And especially graphic designers. My goodness, do you have typography? Like, are you going to excite me about what I'm about to see from a visual perspective? And is there
Mm-hmm.
typography or colors or any kind of gradients? Like, how are you presenting yourself as your portrait? Is like anything a little extra oomph.
So in your opinion, now thinking about, like that's a relationship graphic design to UX design, like what would you say if you would talk to a graphic designer right now, like who's thinking about transitioning to UX, like what would you tell them in terms of like what advice would you give them? Like what is there something they should be looking for specifically based on their past history? What advice would you give them?
From from a human perspective first, I would say be gentle with yourself. I think you have to understand, even though you're still in the creative world, this is a whole new world. And
Mm-hmm.
so being humble enough to say, okay, I'm starting not from scratch, but like I need to start from the beginning and really understand this. And I have this additional added value of the graphic design, which is great and which will serve you. But just be humble enough to kind of put your head down and learn the human centered design process, the design thinking, all this jargon that we use, be able to look at other people's portfolios, network, all that. It's gonna be like it's like starting a new thing, like a new language, and that's okay. Um, and so, and then as far as the hard skills, again, it's like dive into the process, human centered design, and like really build that. What is empathy? Now everybody uses the word empathy everywhere, right? But it's like, what does
Right,
it really
right.
mean? What are the different methodologies and frameworks? What resonates with me? And then question the ones that don't. Because I also am at the point where I'm like, just because someone said we have to do it this way doesn't mean it's right. And everything is changing and pivoting. And so like not everything is gonna resonate, and that's okay. And you might have your own take with your experience on what that could be, and that's okay. Learn the fundamentals, know what they are, and then understand how that applies to you.